Bringing life to an ancient route, a new rail link runs all the way from China to Britain, echoing the fabled Silk Road. What does it mean for global trade and for Chinese power? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the show. I'm Sami Zaidan. The term Silk Road evokes ancient images of merchants travelling in dusty caravans, taking months to make their way from Asia to Europe. But the route is receiving a pretty significant facelift. A trainload of Chinese goods arrived in London on Wednesday after making a trip halfway across the world. Well, it's meant to be a revival of the 2,000-year-old trade route, one that's supposed to benefit both the East and West. We'll get to our guests in a moment, but first, this report from Sonia Gallego.
The train that came from the east and rolled into London's East End. In ceremonious style. This is the first freight train from China's Zhejiang province to Britain, and its backers hope the beginning of a frequent service between the two countries.
It's very exciting. This is modern rail freight in action, international rail freight, and we want more of this. We want to get more freight off our congested road networks, for example, in the UK and across Europe, and it's much cleaner. It's also much safer than road freight.
The train's journey began in the city of Yiwu, an historically important trading centre. It's travelled across Kazakhstan, Russia and Germany, went through the Channel Tunnel to arrive in London on Wednesday. The freight has crossed 12,000 kilometres in just under 18 days, and the containers are holding textiles and other consumer goods. And in a post-Brexit Britain, which is looking at expanding its trade beyond the European Union, this may well be a desirable option.
There is an increasing middle class in China of hundreds and hundreds of millions who are educated, internationalized, curious about advanced engineering products, about innovative, creative design, and that's something that the UK is particularly good at. This is a really, really key time for the UK to succeed in China.
This new Silk Route is taking on the increasing trade between Europe and the Far East. There is already a service in place between Yiwu and Madrid, with one train a week leaving Spain with goods bound for China. It's twice as quick as shipping and half the cost of air transport. And it's an opportunity for EU countries to capitalise with their fastest growing export market. Trade between China and the EU amounts to about $1 billion per day. The UK's trade is $70 billion per year. Out of that, it imports $55 billion worth. But this month heralds the start of the year of the rooster in the Chinese horoscope. A year of progress and opportunity, say believers. Certainly a hope for those batting for a UK looking beyond the confines of the European Union. Sonia Gallego, Al Jazeera, London.
Well, the East Wind train line carried products worth nearly $5 million, including clothes, suitcases, purses and wallets, all loaded onto 34 wagons. And it's carrying British machinery, Spanish hams and cheeses and German beer on the return trip back to China. The direct train costs about half as much as air transportation and is 2 weeks faster than sea routes. There are some logistical complications. The containers have to be unloaded and placed on different wagons at various points along the trip because of different track gauges in some of the countries the train crosses. And how cost-effective the new route really is, well, that's still an open question. Let's bring in our guests into the show. We have joining us from London, Steve Tsang, Director of the China Institute at London School of Oriental and African Studies. From Hong Kong on Skype, Pauline Leung, Managing Director of Asia Analytica. And also in the British capital, Charles Parton, former councillor with the European Union's China delegation. Welcome to you all. If I could start with Steve. So, is the Silk Road being revived? How much should we be celebrating this?
Well, the Chinese are certainly celebrating this. The Belt and Road Initiative really was started in China because President Xi Jinping needed and wanted to have a signature policy initiative for engaging with the external world. And therefore, the idea of the old Silk Road was being revived and modified to become this Silk Road Economic Belt and the Maritime Silk Road. The railway network connecting China to London is, of course, the land route. But how much benefit is bringing to the UK or to Western Europe, I think that remains to be seen. It will certainly bring more benefits to countries along the way, in particular countries like Pakistan.
All right, we're going to pick up on those points. Good points there. But before we do, Charles, how commercially viable is the East Wind train service when it's still cheaper to ship goods, isn't it?
Well, I would say that actually this is mainly a symbolic, it's a PR exercise, and a very good one, because I mean, it comes the day after Xi Jinping spoke at Davos, and if you look at his speech, the last two paragraphs were on One Belt, One Road, or Belt and Road Initiative, depending which way you want to call it. But actually, as a train service, as a goods service, I can't think it makes economic sense. After all, if you want small
Why not, Charles?
value, high value, well, I think you tend to send high value small items by air if there's a real urgency, and otherwise you send things in bulk. I mean, what was delivered this week were things that really could be quite happily, they're not urgent, they could be shipped at far cheaper cost in a pipeline on containers by ship. So I don't dismiss rail travel as a possible viable option for goods that are mildly urgent, computer goods, things that are made in the center and west of China. But anything that comes from the main industrial places on the east, I would have thought is, for the foreseeable future, going to go by ship, and there's very small valuable things by air.
All right, interesting point, Paulie. Mainly a PR exercise for Charles. Is the real point of this East Wind service then simply to boost China's westwards connections?
Well, I wouldn't say simply to boost China's westward connections, but I totally agree with Charles that it's a PR stunt. To call it the Silk Road, that's really brilliant, evocative of romantic camel travels in the past. You know, when you know you have these lovely silks and trade and so forth. But
what is China PRing, if I could use that term here, other than the memories of lovely camels and silk?
It's the whole idea of, you know, let's revive the trade with China, which is a wonderful thing, or a romantic thing. Everyone benefited. And China is trying to build on that historic romantic image. And it's good because look at all the headlines it has been getting. But in practical terms, it's early days yet.
Let me come back to Steve. You mentioned a moment ago some of the countries along the route will benefit from this. You mentioned Pakistan. How much real commitment and interest is there from countries along the route in this sort of project?
Well, I think for the Central Asian countries who are along the route and can benefit from a rather more flexible definition of the Silk Road Economic Belt, they would be able to engage with China and to try to get as much developmental aid and investment and support as possible from China. Now, all these countries are very much aware that the Belt and Road Initiative is going to be a flagship policy for the Chinese government as long as President Xi Jinping is in power. It also means the Chinese government will put in a lot of resources to make this initiative appear to be successful. So support for those countries would be more likely to be forthcoming with this policy initiative than not. And they can, of course, also play this up against the Russians to see that the Russians may well be giving them some other support so that this old Russian backyard does not become a Chinese backyard.
All right, so maybe a bit of a game going on. Let me go back to Pauline. How important is Central Asia to Chinese interests, and how important are the sort of Belt and Road initiatives that Steve is talking about to those interests in Central Asia?
I think Central Asia is far more important to China than the EU or Britain, which makes very good press. But in terms of practical value, the smaller nations, the poorer nations, they are where China wants to establish a commercial relationship as well as political relationship. And China will be providing a lot of the financing. That is how this is going to succeed, through money. And one thing I could see that would be very beneficial for China is if these countries could be persuaded to accept the renminbi. That would help greatly in the globalization of the renminbi and using it to pay for goods outside China. And if you're borrowing from the Chinese and they say, right, I'll lend you some money, but I'll lend it to you in renminbi cheaply, you tend to say, yeah, okay.
Well, perhaps a country which has found it can do business with China increasingly, Russia. And Charles in London, Russia also expanding its high-speed rail lines, plans to tie the Moscow-Kazan line at some point into China's Belt and Road Initiative. Do you see a scenario where this whole sort of project, train project, could take off with several countries in the region very rapidly?
Well, I think China is determined to ensure that its own train companies and train construction companies, rail construction companies do very well throughout the world. I mean, that's one of the motives behind the whole initiative, is to ensure that Chinese companies compete on the world stage. So the degree to which there will be cooperation or competition between Russia and China over rail, I suspect the Chinese will probably wipe the floor in that aspect. I'd just like to go back a little bit, because I think the concentration so far in this conversation has been very much on, let's call it OBOR, because that's what the Chinese do, although I think Belt and Road is probably a better phrase. But the emphasis has been on it as a foreign policy issue. And actually, I think if you look at the origins of the policy, it's very much a domestic policy with geostrategic ramifications or consequences. I think if you look at the original people and scholars who put up this idea to Xi Jinping, actually to reinvent or rebrand a policy that was already in existence, which was to go global. If you look at the original motivations for that, they were almost all domestic. That is to say, China realizes that it's got to play a large part in the global economy if it's to continue to prosper economically, which it has to do to keep its citizens happy. And that requires its companies to go out. It requires more markets. It requires investing abroad. So, and it requires resources. If you look at the routes, that the land routes, and there are now I think up to 6 of them, but of the original 3, 2 of them ended in Dubai. Why? Because that's where there's an awful lot of energy. And also, if you look at the whole sea aspect of the Belt and Road Initiative, and that's probably the more important than the land one for reasons we could get to, the port building and everything else, those routes are aimed quite largely at Africa. So I tend to agree that it's not all about Europe. I think we shouldn't be too Eurocentric about it.
Right.
Let
me jump in here. I mean, I was going to come to domestic issues a little bit later, but now is a good time as any, since Charles has taken us down that route, no pun intended. Let me come back to Pauline, since you're in China. To what extent are projects like this, not just the East Wind train service, but we know that the Belt and Road Initiative is quite extensive. Are they transforming the interior regions of China, would you say, Pauline?
I might not use the word transforming because it's early days yet, but it's definitely a big boost for the western, southern regions, the poorer regions of China, and that would kickstart a lot of trade, a lot of investment both ways. Yes, it is very.
Pauline, the researchers tell us that new urban areas are springing up along these train tracks, for example, and the train tracks have exploded. The high-speed rail lines in China have gone from 0 to over 19,000 kilometers of high-speed rail line in just 10 years.
Yes, I'm going to say the obvious. China is a very big country, and rail is one of the most reliable ways of communications and the easiest, quickest for people within the country as not many farmers can afford to go air travel
Right.
or drive along the road. So train is very important to China.
All right, I could see Steve wanted to get in here. Go ahead, Steve.
Yes, I think we need to bear in mind that for the new urban centers, cities and towns that are being developed along the high-speed rail links to the west within China itself, who are the people who are going to be living in these new urban centers and developments and manning all those services? Are they going to be Han Chinese, or are they going to be the local ethnic minorities people? So in some ways, I think all these new developments may
But what are
well
we seeing,
increase
Steve?
the tension. Well, we are seeing, in fact, of course, the Han Chinese who are mostly moving to those places to provide the services that are being created. And therefore, we're seeing even more Han Chinese settlers settling in the western parts of China, where you usually have more of the ethnic minorities living. And you're going to result in increased tension between the ethnic groups. And I think that is something which potentially is problematic. I think we also need to bear in mind, in terms of the Belt and Road focus of the Chinese government, that it is, I think Charles is right to say that it is part of the going out policy. But for China to genuinely go global, then it really needs to be very flexible and tries to go anywhere and everywhere where the best opportunities are available for Chinese investments and business and trade. But the focus on the Belt and Road means that there is a certain element of distortion, that Chinese companies and leaders and tycoons are being encouraged to look at projects that can somehow be fitted into the Belt and Road framework. Mm-hmm. They may not, in fact, be the best business investment opportunities for Chinese entrepreneurs.
All right, maybe not the best business opportunities, but Charles, is it at least creating a better connected economy, pushing wealth a little bit further out of traditional centres?
That's certainly the aim, and one of the main Chinese worries is the imbalance between the very rich provinces in the east and the rather poor ones in the west. And so the aim has been for some years now, well preceding Xi Jinping, to try and move that development westwards. Another angle of it, which I think Steve began to touch on, is in terms of the minority peoples. I mean, China believes very strongly that the way to combat Islamic influence, radicalism and terrorism is to replace religion as the opiate of the masses by economic development and prosperity. So the more prosperity you can bring to Xinjiang, and that's where the routes pass through, and Xinjiang is full of a number of Muslim minorities, and particularly the Uyghurs, the more prosperity you can bring there, then the greater likelihood the Chinese believe that there will be stability there. And then across the border, and this is where it becomes more geostrategic and international, if you can bring also prosperity to the stans, to Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan and all the others, and therefore one hopes reduce radicalism there, then the chances of that radicalism flowing back into Xinjiang and upsetting the Uyghur population and others there is much reduced. So it is about bringing development and prosperity to the West, but it's in order to ensure that there's stability there, because one of the threats to the party and its legitimacy and its staying in power might be instability in the West.
All right, we were talking a little bit. We started to push out into the international implications of the East Wind and Belt and Road Initiative. Let me try and take us back there then and ask Pauline, what sort of potential does this project have to reshape trade amongst Asian countries themselves, between the stands, between Russia and China, if at least some of these countries, we're told, are buying in?
Well, that is going to take a long time, because this is so new, and the amount of money that would be available to develop it, given how the Chinese economy is doing, that's a big question. But I'd like to actually introduce the question of risk. The Belt and Road, particularly the Silk Road area, goes through some of the most turbulent and unstable areas in Central Asia. And when you have a train going through all these different borders, with all these different peoples with their budgets and their problems, it is going to be very difficult to ensure that it is not subject to a lot of terrorism and attacks.
All right, so a bit of risk involved. Let me come back to Charles briefly and say then, given some of the doubts you expressed, what we're hearing from Pauline, is this sort of picture, here's one piece of research, is this a little bit fanciful then, that the area from China to the west of Europe, projects like this can create an area that's worth $2.2 trillion a year in a decade? Is that a bit fanciful, do you think?
Well, I think it's extremely long term for a start. And I would just back up what Pauline said. And in fact, it reinforces why I think that the sea routes are actually rather more important than the land routes. It's much more difficult to intercept ships on the high seas than it is a train or a pipeline. The other point I think we should focus on is that we shouldn't just concentrate on trains and transport. If you look at the plan of the Belt and Road Initiative, which came out in March 2015, it's divided into 4 areas, of which transport and infrastructure is just one. The other 3 are trade and investment. It's about ensuring that customs standards are unified to facilitate trade. It's about, and thirdly, the third area is financial cooperation, which of course is extremely interesting to the UK, and we were the first to jump into, of the European countries anyway, to jump into the AIIB, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. And the fourth area in the plan is people-to-people links, by which they mean increasing tourism, students, science and technology exchanges, parliamentary exchanges, you name it. Mm-hmm. So Xi Jinping's concept is extremely broad, and we shouldn't just get hung up on the trains and the infrastructure.
All right, let's keep that broad mind there that Charles is urging us to keep, and continue the discussion talking broadly, Steve, about the Belt and Road initiatives. To what extent does that offer a challenge, impact, perhaps even a disruption of current trade routes?
Well, I think it may cause distortion of the current trade routes. I don't think it's going to actually cause particular problems for it. I think there is something else which one could add to what Charles has already said about the 4 objectives, and there is a 5th unspoken one, which is in effect to extend and project Chinese influence and power, and through the success of the Belt and Road Initiative, to demonstrate to the rest of the world that China can extend its influence in a soft way and get all these countries engaged and move in a cooperative directions led by the Chinese for a better future. Now, I think that is the kind of basic idea underlying it all. Whether the Chinese can achieve that or not, I think is a big question. You start off with your theme underlying that across the railway route, going back to the railway, that you are going through countries with different gauges, and goods needs to be offloaded from wagons to one to the other. Mm-hmm. Of course, from the Chinese perspective, that's a great opportunity to help all these countries to standardize their railway gauges, and then the train can roll freely from Zhejiang province to the United Kingdom. But that's not going to happen, because even in your Central Asian countries, right, they don't really want to see things go so far.
All right. So
that is one of those big challenges.
All right. Thanks to all our guests, though, Steve Zhang, Pauline Leung, and Charles Parton. And thank you, too, for watching. You can see the show again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com, or for further discussion, head over to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle there is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Sami Zaidan, and the whole team here now, it's goodbye.